On our broadcast tonight, Korea and Canada reach a free trade agreement, bringing to an end almost a decade of an on and off talks. A look at how it's going to affect the auto and agriculture sectors of the two countries. Seoul and Tokyo will hold their first high-level meeting in 8 months amid soured relations that had dipped to their lowest level in years, following Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to the controversial Yasukuni War Shrine late last year. And plus, the Fukushima nuclear meltdown 3 years on. Lawmakers in Korea marked the day by urging the government to reduce its reliance on nuclear power and encouraging the people to think about the country's energy future. But these stories and more next on ARIRANG News at 8. Good evening to our viewers in Korea, and hello to those of you who are watching from around the world. It's Tuesday, March 11th here in Seoul. I am Yoo Ji-hye. We begin with some good news on the trade front. Following their second summit talks in less than 6 months, President Park Geun-hye and visiting Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper have come to an agreement on a long-stalled bilateral free trade deal. Our presidential office correspondent Choi You-sun has our top story.
After 9 long years of on and off negotiations, Korea and Canada have finally agreed to ink a bilateral free trade agreement. The announcement came after President Park Geun-hye and Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper met for summit talks in Seoul on Tuesday. Korea's comprehensive trade pact with its 25th trading partner goes beyond goods and services to include investments, finance, and intellectual property. Over the next 10 years, each side will lift tariffs on nearly 98% of goods. For Korean automakers whose products make up almost half of the nation's $10 billion annual exports to Canada, the 6% tariff barrier will be removed in 2 years. This means Korean companies like Hyundai and Kia, which currently make up 12% of the Canadian market, will be able to make further inroads in the North American country. While more than 200 farm products, including rice, are exempt from the deal, relatively high tariffs of up to 40% on Korean beef and pork will be partially lifted over the next 5 to 15 years. To allay concerns among Korean livestock farmers worried about the impact of trade deals with both Canada and Australia, Seoul says it's working on measures to assist them. With the latest agreement, Korea also hopes to tap into Canada's rich reserves, such as oil and natural gas. On the Canadian side, hopes are high that its first FTA with an Asian country will lead to expanded trade in the region. Canada is now Korea's 12th FTA partner. After the deal is signed and approved by the parliaments of each country, it is expected to go into effect next year. Stressing that bilateral security cooperation is as important as economic issues, Prime Minister Harper expressed support for President Park's trust-building policies towards North Korea. The two leaders then urged Pyongyang to completely and verifiably rid itself of all its nuclear arms. Choi You-sun, ARIRANG News.
The vice foreign ministers of Korea and Japan will meet for talks in Seoul on Wednesday on security and bilateral issues for the first time in 8 months. But our Hwang Sung-hee says no one is holding out much hope for the dialogue.
Amid souring ties between South Korea and Japan, Japanese Vice Foreign Minister Akitaka Saiki will arrive in Seoul Wednesday for talks with his South Korean counterpart, Jo Tae-yong. Wednesday's talks will be the first vice ministerial-level meeting between the two neighboring countries in 8 months. But Seoul's foreign ministry says it's not a sign of thawing ties.
The South Korean government repeated several times what steps Japan must take for progress in Korea-Japan ties.
Japan has yet to officially apologize for its wartime sexual enslavement of roughly 200,000 women in the early 20th century. In an interview with Japan's Mainichi Shimbun Tuesday, Chinese ambassador to Japan, Chang Yong-hwa, called out Tokyo for its lack of responsibility over historical issues, speaking about why the annual trilateral summit between South Korea, China, and Japan did not take place last year. The Chinese diplomat blamed Japan and said he does not see such a meeting happening in the near future. But U.S. President Barack Obama will try to mediate when he visits Seoul and Tokyo for summit talks in April. Washington wants its two allies to put history behind them, concerned the intensifying friction will affect their trilateral alliance. Ahead of President Obama's trip, the three leaders will meet at the end of this month in The Hague for the Nuclear Security Summit. Some point to the possibility of a trilateral summit, but the chances of the two neighbors shaking hands are slim. South Korean President Park Geun-hye has made it perfectly clear that she will not sit down with a leader who fails to acknowledge his country's historical wrongdoings. Hwang Sang-hee, ARIRANG News.
The Korea scandal-ridden spy agency is under fire once again. Prosecutors raided the headquarters of the National Intelligence Service late Monday over suspicions it fabricated evidence in an espionage case. Yoo Ri-an reports.
The nation's spy agency is staring down the barrel of another scandal. Prosecutors on Tuesday are digging into documents seized during a 7-hour raid of the National Intelligence Service overnight. The NIS, already a target of public criticism for meddling in the 2012 presidential election, is suspected of tampering with documents to support its charge that a Seoul city government official is a North Korean spy. The suspicions have gained traction in recent days. After an NIS informant claimed he had yet to receive money he was promised for faking the documents. The prosecution's raid came hours after President Park Geun-hye ordered a thorough investigation into the case. This is the second time the prosecution has raided the spy agency since President Park came into office more than a year ago. In April last year, prosecutors looked into allegations that the National Intelligence Service's former chief ordering agents to drum up support online for then-candidate Park in the 2012 election. Late last year, the National Assembly passed a bill requiring an overhaul of the spy agency and banning it from participating in domestic politics. The back-to-back scandals are fueling the public's distrust of the NIS, with opposition politicians calling for the resignation of NIS chief Nam Jae-jun. Depending on the investigation outcome, NIS agents involved in the scandal could be charged with breaching the national security law for the first time ever in history. Yoo Ri-an, ARIRANG News.
Phase 2 of a massive medical strike has begun here in Korea. This comes after tens of thousands of doctors walked off the job Monday. For the next week and a half or so, doctors taking part in the strike will cut their work hours and limit time spent with patients. Our Kwon So-ah has the details.
The medical strike has just begun. After Monday's walkout, the Korean Medical Association is progressing to the next round of its strike as planned. While those taking part in Monday's strike refused to provide any medical services, starting Tuesday through March 23rd, doctors will turn to a work-to-rule action. This means they won't work more than 40 hours a week, which is around 10 hours fewer than usual, and will treat patients for no longer than 15 minutes. A full 6-day strike is then planned to begin on March 24th, which could also include the closing of emergency rooms and intensive care centers. If residents and interns participate in the 2-week strike too, there are concerns this will affect the public, considering they work up to 100 hours a week. Although some patients were inconvenienced by Monday's walkout, it didn't create as much chaos as initially feared. The government has reiterated it will react strongly to illegal actions that put the health of the public at risk. The health ministry estimates around 29% of doctors at hospitals and local clinics took part in Monday's walkout, while the Medical Association puts the figure at 49%. As big as that discrepancy are the stark differences in opinion over the government's health reform plans, which prompted the KMA strike. KMA doctors are against government plans to introduce a telemedicine system that would allow for patients in remote areas to be diagnosed and treated via webcam, smartphone, or even email, saying this will impair the quality of medical services. The KMA is also up in arms over the government's move to run for-profit subsidiaries. Some doctors are worried the reforms could eventually lead to privatization of the medical sector. The Medical Association says it expects even more doctors to take part in the second round of strikes. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
It's happened again. A total of 12 million more Koreans have had their personal information leaked. This time, it's customers of Korea's 3 major telecom providers, financial institutions, and online shopping malls. The Busan Metropolitan Police Agency said Tuesday that it has booked 17 people without detention for collecting, analyzing, and selling personal data, which includes phone numbers, addresses, and bank account numbers. The police said the criminals hacked into the computers of telecommunication retail stores to obtain the information.
For the latest news that impacts Korea and the world, join Yoo Ji-hye for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on ARIRANG TV.
Move aimed at fostering startups as part of the government's 3-year economic innovation. Over in North Korea, the results of its first national election under its young leader Kim Jongun are out. 2 days after the vote, the country's Central Election Committee said Tuesday all 687 candidates running for a spot in the Supreme People's Assembly garnered 100% of the vote. We must note that there's only one state-sanctioned candidate for each constituency in these elections to ensure a foregone conclusion. Kim Jongun, the aunt of the young leader, was retained as a party member despite the execution of her husband Chang Song-taek last year, while officials who had connections to Chang failed to secure a spot. Kim Jong-un's younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, was also not included in the list. It has been 3 years since the meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant in Japan, and the effects of the crisis are still being felt. To raise awareness of the lessons from the deadly disaster, lawmakers in Korea held an event at the parliament. Our National Assembly correspondent Kim Jongun was there.
Lawmakers at the National Assembly urged the government to reduce the country's reliance on nuclear power as its main source of electricity at an event Tuesday held in remembrance of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. The lawmakers advised the public not to forget the lessons of the incident in Japan and to consider the implications for Korea. One lawmaker reported on her 3-day visit to radiation-exposed sites around Fukushima.
After 3 years, most of the contaminated areas stand in neglect, and people are still suffering. The Japanese government says the Fukushima disaster is mostly under control. There is a big problem with remarks like that, and the Korean government's plans to build more nuclear power plants.
Han Myung-suk, who leads the Parliamentary Sustainable Development Committee, lashed out at the Japanese government for restarting the country's nuclear reactors.
The Japanese people, and especially children, are still suffering 3 years after the crisis. The Abe administration has broken its promise of denuclearization, and I believe the government is out of its mind to restart the nuclear power plants. Abe is sure to be disregarded by his people.
Meanwhile, the government is trying to use more renewable energy resources. The National Assembly has its own solar panels, which generate roughly 165 kilowatts of electricity per year. The panels are capable of reducing carbon dioxide levels by some 87 tons per year. Last year, the National Assembly passed a bill requiring that 10% of the electricity in all new buildings in Seoul that are more than 100 square meters come from renewable energy resources. The bill also requires that more than 50% of the lights in the buildings have LED bulbs. Kim Jongun, ARIRANG News.
Ever since her inauguration, President Park Geun-hye has been pushing to help Korea shake its image as a fast follower, but instead become an innovative hub for developing new growth engines. The core ministry in charge of the president's drive announced more specifics today. Our Na Young-kyung reports.
The ICT and Future Planning Ministry has unveiled a detailed roadmap for how the government intends to realize a creative economy this year. At a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, the ministry said a significant amount of this year's 2.5 trillion won, or roughly $2.3 billion budget will go toward producing more visible results. On top of a 100 billion won or $94 million fund created last year to give venture startups a leg up, the government will invest additional $94 million this year. And another $94 million, a five-fold increase from 2013, will be injected into a project dubbed the Creative Vitamin Project, aimed at meshing science and technology with existing sectors. This is in line with a major goal that the President Park Geun-hye administration has been pushing ever since coming into office in February last year, developing new and creative growth engines for the country. The ministry plans to focus on making private entities take the lead and launching initiatives toward realizing a creative economy this year. It also plans on expanding this initiative from the central to local governments and helping more young entrepreneurs develop their innovative ideas so they can break into the global market. However, with some media reports pointing out that the ministry spent only 3% of its total budget in January, critics are voicing concerns that the money allocated for building a creative economy could go to waste if the government does not set up clearer guidelines for how the money is to be spent. 나현경, ARIRANG News.
Household loans fell for the first time in nearly a year in January due to a drop in mortgage and credit loans. The Bank of Korea said Tuesday the amount of outstanding household loans by local banks and non-bank institutions amounted to $643 billion in January, down nearly $2 billion for a month earlier. The central bank said this is the first time since February of last year that household lending had declined. It attributed the fall to an end of tax benefits for home purchases that reduced the number of people with mortgage loans. Year-end bonuses may have also helped curb demand for such loans. The rumors are already swirling around the next generation Nexus smartphone. The reports are hinting that Google will once again tap LG, Korea's #2 tech giant, as the manufacturer of its upcoming smart product, which are slated for release later this year. Our Kim Ji-yeon tells us more.
Google has partnered up with LG for the production of a new smartwatch and other wearable devices. The U.S. tech giant is likely to release its flagship smartphone, the Nexus 6, this fall, and the device is reportedly based on LG's upcoming G3 smartphone. Google and LG had collaborated in 2012 on the Nexus 4, and it was an instant hit with Android fans. Google is also moving to expand the Android operating system on its smartphones to its wearable devices. Google Senior Vice President Sundar Pichai says in 2 weeks, the company will release the software programs for its wearable devices, including smartwatches and smart jackets, which are equipped with sensors. The upcoming Nexus smartwatch will be Google's entry into the rapidly expanding smartwatch market. It will join Samsung's Galaxy Gear and an anticipated iWatch from Apple. Samsung unveiled smartwatches with its independent operating system, the Tizen, last month.
The Gear 2 and the Gear Fit. We will release these incredible devices in nearly 150 countries.
The market for wearable devices is expected to expand to around $30 billion by the year 2018. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
And moving now to some of the top stories on the global front, from the expanded search for that missing Malaysian airliner to the upcoming anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing, we go over now to our Polly at the News Center. Now, Paul, let's start with the search operations of the Malaysian airliner that entered a fourth day Tuesday. What's the latest?
Well, GA, authorities are still no closer to finding Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, but they have identified one of the passengers that boarded the plane with a stolen passport as a young Iranian man. Our Connie Kim has the details.
Nearly 4 days have passed since Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished, and authorities have now widened their search for the plane beyond its flight path. Rescue teams are now scouring the Gulf of Thailand, the South China Sea, and the west coast of Malaysia. The expansion of the search area came after China pushed Malaysian authorities to step up search efforts for the missing airliner. 2/3 of the plane's passengers were Chinese. A total of 9 countries are now participating in search operations. On Monday, crew members of a Cathay Pacific bound for Kuala Lumpur spotted large debris on the southeastern coast of Vietnam. Authorities, however, have yet to confirm that the debris is part of the missing aircraft. As for what brought the plane down, authorities haven't ruled out any possibilities, including a terrorist attack.
We are still looking into the case. Mentioning the possibility of a terror attack is not appropriate.
As for two of the passengers on Flight 370 that were flying on stolen passports, Malaysian police say one of them has been identified as a 19-year-old Iranian. They don't believe he has any links to terrorist groups and think he was trying to make it to Germany to seek asylum. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 took off from Kuala Lumpur on Saturday, but vanished from radar en route to Beijing. There have been sightings of oil slicks and pieces of debris, but international efforts to find any wreckage have failed, this despite 40 ships and nearly 36 planes taking part in search operations. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
Over now to Europe, where diplomatic efforts to resolve the building tensions in Ukraine are intensifying. Ukraine's government has asked the Council of Europe to investigate the clashes that led up to the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych. Crimea is set to hold a referendum on Sunday to decide whether to establish closer ties with Moscow or join the Russian Federation altogether. During talks in Kiev Monday, Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk said any results from the referendum would be illegitimate.
I'm absolutely certain that this referendum could be recognized by North Korea and probably Syria, and that's it. We are appealing to the Russian Federation to immediately cancel the referendum.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has rejected an offer to hold talks on the crisis with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kerry said any negotiations would be extremely difficult in the face of Moscow's military intervention in the country. And heading over to the United States, it's been nearly a year since the deadly Boston Marathon bombings that killed 3 people and injured 260 others. But it hasn't stopped the American city from pushing ahead with its iconic race this year on April 21st. Local and federal authorities held a news briefing on Monday outlining enhanced security measures for the 118th Boston Marathon. More than 3,500 officers will be deployed to cover the 42-kilometer course, while public security screenings will also be expanded. The Boston Athletics Association says that more than 3,600 runners are set to compete next month, which is 9,000 more than last year. At least 1 million spectators are expected to attend. That wraps up our look at international stories making headlines around the world. I'll be back with more updates in just about 2 hours.
And time to get a check on the weather with our Kim Bo-kyung at the Weather Center. The Bo-kyung, it was another dry day here in the capital, but I hear relief is on the way.
That's right. Afternoon highs rose all the way to the low to mid-teens here in Korea. However, as Ji-hye mentioned, dry weather advisories are still in effect throughout the country. In fact, in both Gyeongsang-do provinces where dry weather alerts have been issued, humidity levels have dipped to the single digits or to the low teens. So please be careful not to start any forest fires. Taking a closer look at the current conditions, due to a high pressure system from the south, we're seeing clear skies across the map, but things are looking quite different for tomorrow. Clouds will gradually move in, leading to nationwide rain, and this round of showers will take away the dry air. The mountains of Jeju may get more than 80 millimeters of precipitation, and most parts of the country 5 to 30 millimeters, so please make sure to have an umbrella handy. Moving on to Wednesday's readings, Seoul starts off the day at 3 degrees with a high of 11. Meanwhile, cities down south make it to the low to mid-teens. Moving on to other regions, Daejeon and Dokdo peaks at 11, while Mount Kumgang makes it to 3. That's all for now, and I'll be back with more after 10.
And that brings us to the end of our newscast. I'm Yoo Ji-hye in Seoul. I'll be back with more news updates on our primetime news at 10 p.m. Korea time. See you then.